And I think we're about ready to top. We have Rob Stevens is talking today. You can see the title there, Benedict Arnold's trip. And his assistant in all this is Allison Hepler. A complicated setup is all, but I think it's all ready to go. Take it away, Rob.
This is, I didn't recreate, 4 or 5 of us recreated this journey 2 years ago. And so if you see a color photo, that's a modern picture. There were not color photos back then. The other thing is, Jay Robbins is sitting way over there, and Nathan Lipford and Jim Nelson are there. And so if from those sections you will hear people scoffing. They don't know what they're talking about. So, at the beginning of the Revolution, if we're going to call Lexington and Concord the beginning, Benedict Arnold marched to Boston to volunteer, and on the way he met a person coming from Boston to talk to the Connecticut legislature, and Benedict Arnold told him that he had been told that there were cannons at Fort Ticonderoga, and it was not well guarded. And so at that point in time, independent of each other and not knowing, these two groups decided to go to Ticonderoga and seize the cannons. Ticonderoga is the bottom of the common route for invading Canada. It was sort of a pastime here in the colonies and in Quebec. And this is a list of the soldiers who went on the Benedict Arnold expedition from Woolwich. There may be some names missing from this, but I'm pretty sure I don't like to say weeded out, but I'm pretty sure the names I took out are actually from Pownallborough or Winthrop or what have you. Even in this list, there's some people who probably don't belong here, but John Ball, even though he was born in Balltown and died in Balltown, he was listed for Woolwich, so I'm keeping him. And actually, at the end, I do have a list of all the soldiers from this region, if anybody's interested. This is what I was talking about just a second ago. This was the common invasion route even before the American Revolution. The French and the British would go up and down through Lake George, Lake Champlain, down the Richelieu River, and Montreal is right about here, and Quebec City is right about there. They decided very early on that they should attack Canada. They were hoping to get Canada to join the Revolution. Canada was mostly French Catholic and had only been conquered for the last time, though how were they to know it was the last time, had only been conquered 12 years earlier. French Catholics weren't that crazy about joining a bunch of puritanical New Englanders, but that was the hopes, is that they could get the French Catholics. This is a map. I think it's 1795, and it has the route that Benedict Arnold took. I hope it's outlined, but I don't think it's that easy to see. They started at Cambridge. They marched to Newburyport. They sailed from Newburyport to the mouth of the Kennebec, went up as far as Pittston, where they picked up the bateaux that had been built. A little bit further on to what's now Augusta, where there was Fort. Am I too far up? Oh, thank you. God, no wonder they got lost. The Fort Western is where they all transferred to the Bateaux and started up the river. The other things on this map are Fort Halifax, the Great Carry, which is a 13-mile portage. This right here is the height of land between what's now the United States and Canada. And I think that's the last one. Oh, and Lac Megantic, which is about the beginning of the downhill ride to go to attack Quebec. This route was known. This was not a secret. This is a 1755, 20 years before they did it. This is a 1755 map, mostly of just the coastal area with the Sagadahoc, which is on this map, they're calling the Androscoggin, the Sagadahoc, and the Kennebec River. But you'll see up here is a map of how to get from the Kennebec to Quebec City. And that was put there by a French deserter. And so already 20 years earlier, the route was known. 15 years earlier, in 1760-61, the governor of Massachusetts sent somebody to see if they could build a road from Maine to Quebec. What he investigated was going up the Penobscot, but going up the Penobscot, he ended up, making a portage at Moosehead, and then he ended up doing the same thing that Arnold did was to come over to the 13-mile portage and go up the chain of ponds. So this was already considered. Obviously, the French and Indians had been coming down this route for a century because the Indians weren't too happy with their new neighbors, and you'll see it written down that one white man had done this route. Well, it's sort of a funny way of looking at it, but quite a number of people from Woolwich had already done this route. In other words, quite a number of people from Woolwich had been taken captive by the Indians and marched to Quebec, including the 30 years earlier, the Hilton family, which there were two Hilton family members who were ended up on the Benedict Arnold expedition. The one white man who's credited with having made this trip was a British captain named Montresor, and he did it in 1760, and he drew a map and he kept a journal, and I guess like any good military officer, they have mistakes in it, and they have sections of the journal that are not that have been erased. I mean, something will tell what compass direction or what distance, and that will be erased. So that should it fall into the French hands or what have you, it wouldn't be of any use to them. This is a portion of the map, and this again is the height of land, and this is Lac Megantic, and it doesn't really show there being much in here. Well, this was probably the worst spot on the expedition. This was all marshes, and there was a whole nother lake, which a number of the soldiers went the wrong side of, and so this thing that he left vague did cause them quite a bit of problem. Benedict Arnold had a copy of the map and a copy of the journal, and it's a shame they were sort of at odds with each other, because Montresor was only a couple of miles away in Boston, and they could have chatted and found out what they needed. I threw this one in. If you look at people really just lived right along here. I mean, for about 100 plus years, the Indians and the colonists had been fighting, and the Indians had been and with the help of the French, had been driving the English out. And so they really only lived right through this area here. This is I want to say 1760. I got another map like that. It is interesting. There are surveys of like Skowhegan from 1760. The land speculators were already drawing up maps, dividing up the land, but you really didn't have anybody living there before you didn't have many people living there.
White people.
Thank you. Many white people living there. This was the replica we built. A man named Cecil Pierce over to Southport came up with this design, and it's pretty much a scaled down version of river driving logging bateau that is at the Maine Maritime Museum. And go ahead, yeah.
Somebody.
They complained a lot about the bateaux leaking, and I wanted to make an accurate copy of the bateaux. And though we did use dry pine, we didn't use green, and we had to steam it because we couldn't bend the dry pine. This is another one. This is the beginning of our trip, and we're caulking some of those leaky garboard seams, and that's the sound of a caulking mallet you're hearing there, and we're pouring tar or pitch into the seams to make it somewhat more watertight. And I just threw this in. This is the Reuben Colburn house. This is an old painting or drawing, but the Reuben Colburn house still exists. Now, Reuben Colburn was a shipbuilder. And he kept going down to the Boston area, trying to convince the army to, attack up through Canada. Just to tell you about how much or how little of a wilderness this was, is that when Benedict Arnold's crew showed up here, there was a brig being launched. And I should think a brig would be at least 65 feet. So, they were already having the skills to build big boats. One person writes that he only had 14 days to make these. I think what they did was absolutely amazing. I think they had more than 14 days because Reuben Colburn was already down in Cambridge talking to Washington in mid-August, and by mid-August, Washington had already been considering going up to Kennebec. I think there's two things that support the idea it only had 14 days, and one person wrote that he had 14 days, and that's based on a contract, as he got the contract to build these boats September 3rd. Well, he's a revolutionary. He's trying to overthrow an empire. I don't think, maybe he was willing to start in on this before he had a contract. Maybe he started getting the wood, organizing the people. The other thing is they were thrown together. There's no question that they did tend to leak. But the other thing is that a letter is written to him saying, can you get this food? Can you get, salt pork? Can you get beef? Can you get this? Do you have enough nails? And I, as far as I can tell, that's the only place where there's any reference to there might not be enough nails. It's just the contract being written in Boston asking if there were enough nails. There is the story that they just stole them from the Tories. There were a lot of Tories living across the river. There's also a great story, 30, 40 years ago, some archaeologists found the nails from where a bateau had rotted away, and that made the news. And the guy who was housekeeping the Reuben Colburn house heard a knock on his door, and some woman said, "I've come for my nails." And he's like, what are you talking about? And he says, "It was in the paper. You have my nails. You never paid for them." And I think personally she just had a great joke, but he says it was like she was serious, and he said, "Well, I don't have them. The archaeologist has them." And he suggested she contact the state police, so I don't know if anything was ever done about that. There also were Tories who were willing to make oars and paddles and sell them to the Revolutionaries. Oh, one other thing about how much time they had to make the boats is September 3rd is when the contract is written in Cambridge. People will then go and say, okay, it's going to take 6 days for him to get back to Pittston. Well, the contract was written on September 3rd. He had already sent scouts up the river September 1st. And so it's like if he's already sending scouts up the river to plan the route, he obviously had some ideas about building this fleet. Oh, just in case you forgot, that's a color photo, so that's a modern picture. I will have to say I think our design's a little bit wrong. It's copied right off of a 32-foot or 36-foot river-driving bateau, and I think the overhang is way too much. And I've seen a picture of log drivers putting somebody onto a log jam, and you could see why this 9-foot overhang makes perfect sense, but it doesn't make any sense for carrying cargo up and down a river. It tends to make it quite unstable. And these are modern drawings. This book here, Benedict Arnold's Army by Lefkowitz, I think is an excellent book. I think it's very well researched, and the footnotes are excellent. And these are drawings he has in his collection, and he's showing what the common soldier would wear. It's mostly going to be wool, which was very fortunate because they are going to be wet the whole time. And I know from personal experience that wool will keep you warm. The other interesting thing is, and I just came across this, is that the shoes, they were much more likely to wear shoes than moccasins, which surprised me. I thought that the moccasins were the preferred footwear of the woodsmen at this time. But I guess the shoes were not unreasonable. Plus, the army supplied them to you. Oh, one other thing is, it seems that from the Romans until World War II, a soldier carried about 40 pounds on his back. And then there's the weight of the rifle and the bullets, which probably bring it up to 60. But for all the way from the Roman legions to World War II, that was a standard weight for carrying. This is Fort Western. This is where they could no longer bring any ships up the Kennebec, and they brought the bateaux from Pittston, I think about 9 miles, and they prepared for the trip and loaded up. Wisely, Benedict Arnold sent people off, each one day apart, so they wouldn't bunch up at a portage. It didn't work out perfectly, but it was a good idea as a way of doing it. And something like 70. Oh, the picture of Fort Western and the picture of Fort Halifax are from earlier on. By the time of the Revolution, they were getting a bit derelict. There wasn't really much reason to maintain them after the English took Quebec in 1760. Again, I could point out they didn't know that that was the last time they were going to have to take Quebec, but these forts were not maintained and were in rough shape even by the time of the American Revolution. This is the place where Dr. Center bought a bateau. He says his was leaky and he wanted a nicer one. Dr. Center is 22 years old and he's a bit of a whiner. But you may, just in case you haven't realized, I'm going to blame everything on the officers. The soldiers did just fine. This is probably what they thought they were going to be able to do. You see, there's a couple of men here poling, and nothing to it. Go up the river. Here is a modern drawing. Boy, that's not in focus. And again, there's too many people in it. They talk about having 5 or 6 people in a boat. There really was only 2 or 3 to a boat. At the very beginning, half the men were walking. The function of the bateau was to carry supplies, and so 2 or 3 men would be assigned to the boat to get it up, unlike the 5 or 6 you see in these pictures. And this is more like what it was like. This is actually further up. This is on the Dead River. And you'll notice that boat doesn't have any gear in it. So all they're managing to do is drag this boat up a rocky river. And as you can see, it gets even rockier. One of the strange things about modern day portaging is old people come out of the woods and help you. Just if you don't have your afternoon planned out. And the other thing that happens, that's a slide, that's a video. The other thing that happens is you wear the bottom off the boat. As you can, this right here is a piece of plywood we found alongside the river earlier on and had patched it there, and he's cutting off the piece of wood that protects the hood ends of the planking there. This is Skowhegan Falls. Until they got to the Chaudiere, this might have been about the nastiest, but they're not going to, they portaged around this, but this is one of the many things. In many ways, portaging a half a mile around a set of falls is easier than portaging 5 miles around some rapids that you just can't get up. And actually, this is carrying at Skowhegan, but I use it to describe the Great Carry. The way of moving the boats is every boat was supplied with 4 oars, 2 paddles, and 2 setting poles. And they also wanted to have people who knew how to use a setting pole to take the boats. What they ended up with, farmers. Most of the men from Woolwich were farmers. One of them, at least in his old age, was a fisherman out of a small skiff. But they were not, and even if they were experienced sailors, you could sail around the Horn blindfolded. It didn't mean you can pole a bateau up to Kennebec. And what happens when you fail is you now have this 400-pound boat with 1,000 pounds of gear bouncing back down the river. There's in one of the journals talking about 10 or 12 times and still failing to get up the rapids, and then they hire 2 Indians, and the 2 Indians just pull the boat right up the rapids. And it's in the journals, in the letters from Arnold in Washington. I really think the biggest problem with the bateaux was not having people who knew how to pole. The guys that I went with, 2 of them are paid by the state of Vermont to teach wilderness skills at University of Vermont. They never got the handle of the poles. I can guarantee you, going downriver trying to control a 1,000-pound boat, I mean, as soon as I tried poling, I failed. It is quite a skill to be able to do that. And between, losing the boat down the rapids and dragging it, both in shallow water or over portages, will wear the bottom out of it. As far as portaging goes, mostly, and these were young men. The majority of these men were probably late teens, mid-20s. I don't know that there was more than 1 or 2 people that were over 40 on this trip. But this was, I like this picture of portaging, because actually there's a caption that unfortunately is cut off that says there's too many people portaging this canoe. Normally it would be 4 people portaging a boat, and if you think about it, if you have 4 people near each end, 2 and 2, and you have this on your shoulders and you're going over rugged terrain, you'll adjust over any stump or rock or what have you. But if you have 2 more people in the middle, every time they go over a hump, they've all of a sudden got all the weight. And so it really was a 4-person job. The other thing is, you'll see that the soldiers don't complain about portaging. It's the officers who whine about, trust me, I'm telling you the truth. Yeah. And this I thought was a good picture of portaging, in that it shows, a bunch of men carrying packages along the river, and here a bunch of men are rolling it. You can see a roller there. That was how professionals did it. The other thing is, like, if you want to talk about weight, during this time period, a fur trapper, a voyageur, when he signs up to bring the beaver pelts from western Lake Superior to Montreal, he is signing up to carry a minimum of 180 pounds over the portage. And they'd laugh you out of the canoe if you failed to carry your 180 pounds. The other thing I find interesting is that the meat was packed in 300-pound barrels. They were not thinking of packing it so that that one man could carry that. And it sounds like 4 people would carry it. You'd have 2 poles with rope strung underneath it to carry the barrel. One of the groups said, I'm not doing this. They just cracked open the barrels and took the pork and just draped it over the poles, and figured no sense in carrying the barrel also. Speaking of food, there was a lot of, they lost a huge amount of their food, even by the Great Carry. Again, they complain about the bateaux leaking. They also say that the salt fish was just kept loose in the bateau. At this time period, you would be fined by the colony if you let a cargo get wet. It was you were not in a bateau to not have a good cover over your whatever you're carrying. Actually, I have a figure here for carrying flour. It's like 1 shilling a barrel if you let your flour get wet. The barrels, of pork and beef are supposed to be watertight because it's salt pork and salt beef. And so if the food's getting spoiled, it's in part too that the barrels were probably hastily thrown together. The other thing is there are some references to the beef being put up too near the trip. So really by the time of the Great Portage, they had lost most everything but pork, and somehow they kept biscuits dry. But I'm sort of curious if they even bothered to make a biscuit keg watertight. But they basically lost most of their other food. The people in Stark, Maine, which is across the river from Norwalk, says Stark, Maine still stinks because of all the dead fish Benedict Arnold left there. And this, I'm taking this from the Maine Maritime Museum, idling power units. They did bring oxen with them to help carry things over the portages, though mostly I think they were carrying barrels. They weren't carrying the bateaux themselves. This is an antique cow. I think there's only 500 or 600 of them left in the world. But this is the all-purpose cow of the colonies. It was a milking cow, it was a beef cow, and it was also used as an oxen. I don't know if I said they're American milking Devons. And if you're smart, nowadays you go up the river when there's a bunch of high school kids the high school kids in Skowhegan have a river rescue class, and just happened to run into these guys. The other thing I'll say that, well, there's a couple of advantages, but one other advantage is there were a number of dams that obviously didn't exist. And there are two advantages to dams. One is that you now have a flat backwater behind it, and the other is, what do you find at dams? You find drunken fishermen, and you get the drunken fishermen to help you carry the bateaux around. This is actually, are you in this picture? Yeah. This is the Great Carry. It's about 13 miles long. There are 3 ponds on it that you get a little bit of a rest from. 5 days was about how long it took the soldiers to cross the Great Carry. We had the advantage of having, a dirt road for almost the whole way to roll the bateau, which is what we're doing. And so the guys, 200 plus years ago, it took them 5 days. We took 5 days also. We wouldn't want to make our ancestors look bad. The other thing is we didn't have any of those cows with us, and so we had a pickup truck that carried all the gear. Now, in my defense, I've had a heart attack and I have a pacemaker. These guys were the young guys were just goofing off. They didn't have that excuse. But I think the youngest person who came out, just sort of appeared out of the woods to help us, was 68. And the oldest person, I believe, was 80. And it was a woman. I wish I had a picture. There's a picture of her holding 2 rollers, moving them forward to move the boat. There were at least 4 women that went on the trip. We know the names of 2 of them, and there's speculation that maybe the other 2 came with the troops that turned back. You know, and because we only have one journal that from the troops that turned back. And finally, in the water again, you can see the rollers. No. The rollers that we had for moving it. We were absolutely unwilling to try carrying it. Kids, I don't know. They just don't make them like they used to. This is a video. This is going downriver after a really heavy rain. And this is, if you figure going upriver against this, which is what they would have been doing on the Dead River. A hurricane came through and dropped so much water that hold off, whoa, wait a second. It dropped so much water that the river rose 8 to 12 feet. And they talk about hauling the bateaux with the supplies in it, and they're basically doing it by grabbing branches alongside and pulling themselves, and then maybe you'll have somebody with a rope, up ahead pulling it. But that was what these guys did, going up the Dead River. Now, at this point in time of finishing the Great Carry and
Flagstaff Lake?
no, I don't know. There's no Flagstaff Lake. And the hurricane. I'm sorry. And the hurricane. At this point in time, the companies in the rear didn't want to continue on, and they came and they had a meeting of, I believe it was 11 officers. Sorry, it was officers. They had a meeting of 11 officers, including Samuel McCobb, who was from Georgetown or Rouseck or Phippsburg, depending on where you want to give him credit. He's buried in Rouseck. And they voted on whether to continue or not. And the 5 officers from the group of men that had already passed ahead voted to continue. And the 5 officers from the last group, including our group, voted to turn back. And the commander, Colonel Roger Enos, was the deciding vote, and he voted to go forward. Well, his men took him aside and says, no, we're not going forward. And so they turned back. Again, they were criticized then. I think that they were criticized then. They're criticized now. I think they might not deserve as much criticism as they get now. The other 3 battalions had lost their food. So how have these people not lost their food? I mean, they were supposedly carrying more food, but they probably were losing, food at the same rate that the groups forward of them were losing it. They, being the ones coming in the rear, had been following all these destroyed bateaux. They also, coming in the rear, had been seeing all the sick men who'd being sent back. And so they're not getting a very good picture of what's ahead of them. Now, God, I had another senior moment. All right. So they took the vote and they sent them back. They're criticized for how little amount of food they were to share. But when the one journal of the team that returned talks about they were sort of depending on supplies that the army had left in case they'd failed and had to flee. You know, they had been leaving supplies along the trip, and these guys seemed to be dependent on that. One of them drowned above Skowhegan. And a little side thing is only 2 people drowned on this whole trip, which is absolutely amazing. The one guy going back above Skowhegan, and one of the soldiers going down the flooded Chaudiere drowned. And in fact, the Chaudiere destroyed all their boats. They ended up having 1 bateau and 1 canoe survive. But by this time, everything was destroyed. And, oh hell, what did I just push? I pushed that one. Thank you. This is a video. And this is our second day on the Chaudiere. We've probably already swamped about 7 times by now. You won't see it, but we go about 200 feet, and the boat becomes swamped again. And I mean, I absolutely fail at any use of the pole. And there's the boat swamped, and again, 2 of the people on this get paid to teach wilderness skills, and I take extreme pride in managing to keep my gear dry. Well, I was sort of lazy packing, and my gear isn't dry, and they're not in the picture because they're run downstream to try to recover other gear that's not been tied in. And what I'm doing, I'm standing in the water, and I have about 1 foot of rope around me, and it goes around a tree and down to the bateau, and I'm just sitting there. You know, I probably started with 2, and I kept losing more and more, and I kept thinking, boy, I wish those guys would get back here. There's the video again. And this is just the same thing. Look at this is the water that they would have been going, and there's the bateau. You know, one guy there is very expert, had no problem getting that boat out and recovering all the... Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. The journals, you go through the journals, and they'll talk about, this was a heavy carry, this was sort of hard going up the river. You know, there's all this memberships. And then it says, everybody was in a good mood. You know, everybody was just fine. The men are in high spirits. Right above that is talking about the boats being stove to pieces. We did this one. Okay. This is the way it's supposed to be at the end of the day. You know, you turn in our case it would be a bateau, you turn your bateau over, you throw a tarp over it, and you crawl underneath, and you have a pleasant evening. This one here is just after we swamped the boat. I don't know if you can tell, but it's raining. And thank God for birch bark. You know, I don't know how I got that fire going, but it definitely was just birch bark. And I am wearing, except for those pants, it's all wool. And I went to bed, you know, in soaking wet wool, just laying on the ground, and was fine. But the other thing, sure, go ahead. The other thing is, they talk about soldiers going barefoot, and I never could figure out, I mean, I can figure out, I like cold weather, I don't mind being wet. I don't know how you walk down a river filled with softball-sized rocks barefoot. And I think the answer is that, you wore your shoes out. You were one of the people who walked alongside. You had to have a pair of shoes. I don't care how tough your feet were. 3 days in the water, and they would have been as soft as could be. Stopping to repair the boat was common. We had just, at the end of the previous day, opened up the garboard for about 6 feet there. Go ahead and,
You already did.
this one. And
What's your way for underwear? Sacrifice my underwear. No way. I have a pair of underwear.
I get some underwear.
Good use for planes.
It's what? Yeah, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, okay. If for those of you that was too quiet, we were discussing who was going to give up underwear to caulk the boat. I went and I made Hart gave me these beautiful plaid green boxers that were 100% cotton, and caulked them into the boat. And then when I was done, I realized, oh, wait a second, we have scraps of wool. Right? And this is just a half a mile or so past where we were doing that repair work, and it was actually quite beneficial. It was quite beneficial that we basically completely swamped, because around the corner was a big waterfall. And by this point, all the boats but two, a bateau and a canoe, would have been lost. I already talked a little bit about Roger Enos. He was the man who was in charge of quitting. He was a professional soldier. I mean, he had been in the French and Indian War. This was not, some blowhard who said, I'm going to be the boss here. I mean, this was a professional soldier. The other thing is that if you read George Washington, he doesn't like Yankees. And the reason he doesn't like Yankees is they won't do what he tells them to. And they're just not soldiers. They vote, they decide who's going to be the leader. But that's sort of what a revolution is. And so he had his 4 or 5 officers who, wouldn't accept what the vote was. They said, no, we're going back. Doesn't look good, but they went right straight back to the siege of Boston. They didn't, just go home to Woolwich or Poundleborough, what have you, and quit. They went right back to the siege of Boston. Enos, I don't know what his options would have been, but he went right back there, probably knowing full well he'll be court-martialed. He was court-martialed. One thing he had going for him is the only witnesses were the other guys who would turn back. But other field officers and a general, I think there were 24 of them, said that he did the right thing. That continuing on would not have been wise. The other thing about the Woolwich soldiers is I had a list of 15 of them at the beginning there. Most of them, if not all of them, but most of them stayed in the Revolution. They didn't say, this sucks, hooray for the king, I'm staying home. These guys went off to the siege of Boston, and then on to the fight against Burgoyne, the capturing of Burgoyne's army. They were involved in the fight around New York City, the storming of Stony Point. You know where that is?
Up the Hudson.
I'm looking at you, Jim. You're going to tell me where it is? No. I guess it's up the Hudson. And so some of these people served 7 years in the military. One of them served until he became too ill and couldn't continue. One of them was killed on the Benedict Arnold trip. There was this freak accident along this 13-mile portage where at night they built a fire next to a tree, and a limb fell off the tree and killed one of them. Okay. All right. And that's a video. Right here we're reenacting taking all the food back with us to Woolwich. As again, like I say, they were accused of taking all the food. I don't think they did as bad as it sounds. This is that map I showed you at the beginning. You know, they have gone from Boston to Newburyport, up the Kennebec, past Fort Western and Halifax, the Great Carry, the Height of Land, which actually the Height of Land, you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to go to the end of the story, even though the Woolwich part of it's done. And so is Georgetown, so don't get snooty, and Phippsburg. The Height of Land was actually the worst part. I mean, they were by this time, you know, had almost no food, but they also had bad advice, and they went off and got lost in marshes and went the wrong way around a lake that they didn't know existed. And in many ways and they would be doing this up to their waist in frozen water. And this was in many ways part of the roughest part. And they were starving by this time. I think they were probably having a 1-inch cube of pork and half a biscuit for a meal. And now these poor idling power units have, as Allison wrote, become a source of protein. They went in and they butchered the last of their cows on the Dead River. They actually had some dogs with them, which they killed and ate while they were going down alongside the Chaudiere. And Benedict Arnold and a few other men had gone forward, and as soon as he met some French farmer, you know, he bought food and sent them back up the Chaudiere, and the farmers drove a couple of oxen up, and as soon as they saw the oxen, they butchered them, and but you know, they just took some amount and left the rest for the people coming behind them. And this is a drawing of Quebec City soon after the siege of Quebec. A lot of people, you go and you look at Quebec and you say, that's insane. You know, there's no way that you're going to take that. But back at the beginning at Ticonderoga, Benedict Arnold had gone through the mail, and he found a letter that said there were only 700 British soldiers in all of Canada. They had received other information saying there was only like 150 soldiers in Quebec City. The majority of them, around 500-700 of them, had gone to St. John, Fort St. John, which is just above Lake Champlain, and so there was not a lot of soldiers there. It wasn't really clear how much support they would get from the Canadians. The Canadians were only issued 4 bullets. because they didn't trust them with any more than 4 bullets. And there were a couple hundred New Englanders who had moved there, merchants who had moved there since the British took Canada. So it's not totally crazy. I mean, the British had taken Quebec City, 12 years earlier. But the other thing is that it also works as a diversion, and they were considering that. If this would take the pressure off of who they thought General Schuyler, turned out to be General Montgomery, and his attack on Fort St. John and Montreal, then they would be successful. And the Americans did take Fort St. John and Montreal, and then come down and join with Benedict Arnold, and they attacked. One of the reasons why I blame the officers is, otherwise I'm going to have to take a lot of the blame myself. The New Englanders didn't do a very good job. I'm not sure that the riflemen from Pennsylvania did either. But the reason they attacked was a bunch of the troops were going home the next day. Their enlistment had run out. And so, it's like either you attack tonight or we're gone, And so they did attack by what really was I think a freakishly lucky shot. They attacked from 2 directions, and the soldiers on the other side, the British soldiers fired 1 cannon shot, and it killed General Montgomery and the next 3 lead officers in the whole thing, and the next guy was really over his head, and he just turned around and went back to their camp. And so that meant now the British in the city can come around behind Benedict Arnold. The other problem is that Benedict Arnold got shot and was removed from the battlefield right away. For all of his flaws, and there's another picture of them attacking the barricades. For all of his flaws, I'm going to skip that. This is just us rowing up the river giggling. You can give a little bit of that. We took the city because we attacked on Saturday. On the day before, on Friday, we tried to go look at this icebreaker, and they wouldn't let us on the base. And we actually have a beef with that icebreaker. And on Saturday, we rode right up to it and started pounding with it with our oars, and nobody, so if you want to attack Canada, do it on a Saturday. And Benedict Arnold, was an excellent general. And he was basically the savior at the Battle of Saratoga, where they took Burgoyne. And he again gets shot in his leg. And you can't really, have this park and not talk about Benedict Arnold at Saratoga, because he was the one who rallied the troops and got them to attack and what have you. But what they did is this is a statue of his boot and his lower leg, because he was shot in his leg at the beginning of Quebec, and then he was shot in his leg at Saratoga. And the inscription on the back talks about this guy who turned the tide and won, still without ever mentioning his name. It is interesting. There is a grave up the river from McCobb's company, which is the Woolwich, Georgetown, what have you company. One of the guys in the company is buried up the river, and it does say that he went with Benedict Arnold on his tombstone, on his gravestone. Most of the time, what you read, they will just list somebody as having gone to Canada. They will not mention Benedict Arnold's name. And this is one of our Woolwich heroes. This is Abner Wade. I think right away he was promoted to sergeant, And by the time he was done, I think he made it to captain. Half of the men from Woolwich in the Benedict Arnold expedition, at least half of them were promoted. One to be a corporal, a couple to be sergeants, and the rest like captains. These guys were definitely, either they were in favor of the revolution or they hated Woolwich, one or the other. And this is in Nequasset. There's another soldier buried in Nequasset from the Benedict Arnold expedition, and this is just down the road from Allison and I. In the corner here, it says Captain Abner Turner Wade's house. Did I read that right? Farm. I just found out today he was given all of 5th Point for his service in the Revolutionary Army. One of the interesting ways to find out about the soldiers is to look up their pension files, and often what their choices are, either they get $20 or 200 acres of land. That was cheap land. Is that okay? Special. Wilder Nicholson is he was one of the guys on the Bateau trip, and all the videos are Wilder. Harding Carter, it was his idea to do this, and he's also the guy the Viking boat that we did 20-some years ago, and I appreciate him trying to kill me because I get to do it. Oh, that's the other thing, is I don't know how to swim. And so don't go run rapids with people who've been swimming rapids since they were 7, because they'll just, oh, look, we lost something, I'll go get it, I'm not letting go of that boat. And then Debbie Locke, the Woolwich Historical Society, which helped me with the research, and the Blake Locke Homestead of Arousic for supplying the picture of the idling power units.
And the Lillers for providing
Oh,
the picture,
and yes, and the Lillers. Is this my last slide? And just one other thing is, there really are a couple of Benedict Arnold historians here, but there also are some portageurs. I'm bad with names. Norm and Orland. Where's Orland? There. These are at least 2 of the guys who helped us on the trip. I will have to say that, I did want to call this thing. I did want to call this thing the Woolwich Quitters, but I think I should just call it the Harding Carter Cheaters, because these guys drove our gear around and what have you. Thank you.
Thank you.